Have you been on the rob again, Jimmy? I've been practising that Corkhill attitude of aggrieved innocence. So when he's confronted by Jackie,
oh, well, you are no love. I was going to pay you back and blah fucking blah.
Thank you for joining me here at Bert's Books, where a tribute to the very welcome reappearance of those vintage Brookside episodes on the STV platform. I have started to go through, well in fact I already had done one episode concerning one of Brookside's spin-off paperbacks. In that case it was the David Bing Crosby's memoirs. However, we're going to go a shade deeper and darker and very much dirtier here with Jimmy Corkhill's story. There he is, look at him, absolutely bloody wretched. As if through prison bars. I think in fact that's some park where he's sitting on a bench contemplating what he's done. But there we have Jimmy in his kind of default early to mid-90s state. He looks like absolute shit. He's clearly in the grip of drug addiction and with quite a lot on his conscience. So this is a 1995 Brookside novel spin-off, Box Tree Publishing, again authored by Rachel Braverman. I don't know a great deal about Rachel Braverman other than her authorship of these novels. I'm assuming no relation to you know who. Unlike some of the other Brookside related titles, she opted to treat this one as a narrative rather than like a pseudo sort of diary. Jimmy obviously not being the sort of person who would have kept any sort of written record of his dealings. Safe to say he wasn't a diary keeping type of character. Jimmy, he started off as a bit of a peripheral character. He was, I think he appeared sometime around the mid to late 80s, but as an occasional character, he was the kind of dodgy or dodgier, should I say, brother of Billy Corkhill, who actually at the time was a resident in the close. Jimmy was the kind of bad penny in the family. Jimmy was clearly some sort of bad influence, or he took the form of the slightly disreputable uncle to the Corkhill kids. Rod, incidentally and somewhat ironically, landed a job as a copper around this point, which is a first for a member of the Corkhill family, I believe, and he went for a long time by the nickname of Rod the Plod. So why do we care about Jimmy? I mean, it's, you take a look at him there. He's obviously a character who is capable of plumbing the depths. If you've even got a passing recall or interest in those Brookside storylines, Jimmy was clearly capable of some very regrettable acts. Yeah, he's a bit of a jailbird. He's a bit of a habitual criminal. Certainly someone you could point the finger and say manslaughter, if not murder. Why do we care? Now, in spite of all this, the character of Jimmy Corkhill tends to be regarded by the fan base with a great deal of fondness. Now, why would that be? I think partly it's, Dean Sullivan there. He just brought so much to the character that you could hate the sin but love the sinner in Jimmy Corkhill's case, or if not love him, at least maintain a certain level of affection for him. You kind of want him to win out. You want him to, make the right choice. Ultimately, for all the shit that he pulls, Jimmy Corkhill, he's not a malign character so much as he's a character who has very, very poor impulse control. And I think part of his problem, you could almost put it down to a certain naivety. In a way, he's not this kind of smooth, calculating operator. He's not a hard man either, like the way Barry Grant is presented. Jimmy kind of operates on this kind of childish belief that whatever his next little scam or whatever it is that this one will somehow come through, and that everything will come together with the money he makes from whatever little silly fucking thing he's about to do. There's a naive charm in that. which kind of drags us along with him through this journey. And this isn't the complete journey for Jimmy. This book, it leads up to 1995, by which time, as we'll get to, Jimmy is not exactly out of the woods, you might say. But anyway, it begins with Jimmy being released from prison. The admonition from one of the warders that they don't want to see him around there again. Fat fucking Johnson. So Jim's on the outside, you know, looking at picking up the shards of his life. His life outside, anyway, consists of this rather shattered love triangle between his wife since 1971, Jackie. You'll know Jackie well if you've been a viewer of Brookside. She can be a bit shrill, she can be a bit kind of nagging, but she has the forbearance of a saint. That is a constant theme through this. The bottomless well of forgiveness and patience that somehow Jackie is able to summon. Somewhere on Hope Street there is a shrine to the saintliness of Jackie Corkhill, which this book is a testament to. Things aren't very straightforward at this point because it's kind of she's got competition with Kathy, into whose arms Jimmy flees at the first sign of conflict with Jackie, and there's a bit of history there. Take the time Jackie had caught him in his car with Kathy, but without his trousers. "Hi, love," Jimmy had said, winding the window down. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" She gets shrill, understandably. So anyway, this kind of tug-of-war leads to Jimmy spending a lot of time round at his brother Billy's. Now, a night in the Swan reveals that there's a ghost from the Corkhill's past surfaces in the Swan. This takes the form of Joey Godden. Now, there's some history here. There'd been an older Corkhill brother, Frankie. Now, Frankie had been killed in a fight with this Joey some 15 years before. Joey has been in prison for it, but is now out and swanking around Liverpool, showing up in Jimmy's favourite drinking spots. This isn't on. Now, while brother Billy is rather more intent on leaving such matters in the past, he's now shacked up with Sheila Grant. Billy doesn't really need the drama, I think, at this stage, whereas Jimmy, again, not in control of his impulses, is intent on revenge or retribution. He doesn't make a good job of this. Jimmy is not a very successful or convincing hard man by any stretch of the imagination. One attempt lands Jimmy in hospital. Joey doesn't travel far without his heavies in attendance, and ultimately it's left to Barry Grant to lean on Godden to the extent that he keeps out of the Corkhill's way in future. The other somewhat untidy area in Jimmy's life is his relationship with his kids, little Jimmy and Lindsay. Now, a snub from Lindsay's wedding, I think that's to the very problematic Gary, a snub from that wedding leads Jimmy to resolve that he's not going to be small time anymore. He's going to be a success. Now, what the vision of success Jimmy has, and which he actively pursues, is a crime spree, knocking over a jeweller's, I think a post office, basically just a series of robberies for which the place he shares with his long-suffering mate Sinbad becomes the kind of clearinghouse. Now, contrary to form, Jimmy gets away with some of this, and he kind of likes the feeling it gives him. He feels like he's achieving something in the world, I suppose. But, you know, his dive into this level of crime brings him into contact with a character, I think the guy's name is Vinny, who from here Jimmy becomes involved in a rather more serious robbery, which is turning over, I think it's a nightclub or a gambling den, that's run by a fairly heavy crime family. Now, Jimmy is employed to be the driver on this little tickle. What he doesn't realise till late in the day, that one of the other accomplices in this is to be no other than Joey Godden. So this is awkward. Jimmy, at the last minute, when Joey is running out of the premises with a hold all of cash, with a couple of the rivals' heavies in hot pursuit, Jimmy, again on an impulse, decides that Now is the moment for revenge, and he declines to open the car doors, leaving Joey Godden helplessly banging on the outside until a shotgun blast takes care of that little problem for Jimmy, who speeds off into the night. Now, revenge doesn't turn out to be as gratifying as Jimmy would imagine it. It's also put him in rather an awkward position with Vinny, who, although Vinny doesn't exactly extract revenge for this, he kind of lets it be known to Jimmy that he's on thin ice, and Jimmy should effectively keep a very low profile from now on. Which means he's going to have to go straight, at least temporarily. Surprisingly, he at least at first manages this Ron Dicko, his neighbour Ron Dixon, who at this point he's on quite good terms with, ironically. Ron Dicko gives him a job of operating his mobile, what you call it, like a catering van, the Moby. So Jimmy, on the pretext of having a full driving licence, which he doesn't, takes over operation of this and proves quite effective at it. He turns around quite a bit of money, enough to impress Jackie, who's working in Ron Dicko's shop behind the counter at this point. He uses it as leverage to work his charm on getting back with Jax. However, Jimmy's star-crossed luck doesn't hold out forever. He gives Jax a lift in the Moby one day and allows himself to get distracted, bangs into somebody else's car with it. There's not a lot of damage done, but of course here it transpires that I think Jimmy gives Ron Dicko's name and sort of flees, and he tries to find the guy later just to bung him some cash to avoid going through official channels. But in the meantime, the guy has pinned down Ron Dicko, and it all comes out that Jimmy was lying about having a licence. So he's off that gig. However, another opportunity arises. It appears there's a vacant unit in the same parade of shops that Ron Dicko's operating from, and also Mick Jono's Pizza Parlour is there. There's the opportunity there that there's a vacant unit, and Barry Grant appears to be temporarily AWOL. No one's quite sure where he's gone, but given Barry's underworld type of reputation, no one's even sure if he's alive or what's happened. So Jimmy takes advantage of this by effectively squatting this unit to sell knockdown price, this and that. And he does all right for a bit until, I think first of all, Maxie Farnham, posh get, who represents Bazza's lawyers, starts getting a bit heavy about it, and the power gets cut off. So Jimmy improvises with Caligas canisters, which turns out to be a bad idea. But he manages to keep the business running okay. Still, at this point, he's also managed to attain, sort of ironically again, he had managed to attain some sort of minor local hero status in chasing off these members of this hard right group. It was George Webb, I think that was the guy's name. Now this was in a subplot or a side plot to all this. Ron Dicko, who we come to know as one of those kind of amateur racists, shall we say, the kind of nightclub comedian level of racist. Ron has fallen into the orbit of this guy, I think he's running the garage at this point, George, who turns out is a bit more serious about his racism. This is kind of sinister little meetings in pub back rooms. So anyway, George's shaven-headed stormtroopers, Jimmy catches one of them trying to torch Mick Jono's Pizza Parlour one night. Gives the guy a bit of a thumping and finds himself temporarily local hero for a bit. He can do no wrong, things are looking good with Jack. However, somewhat awkwardly, Barry Grant reappears and starts asking for the back rent, which of course Jimmy doesn't have. Now, while he's pondering this problem, it's kind of solved for him by the fact that Cowboy Cuts, as I think his place is called, that's with a K, goes up in flames one night. I don't suppose those Caligas canisters helped with that. Anyway, Jimmy from there is, again, he's at an enforced loose end, but he's unexpectedly given a new opportunity, courtesy of none other than Barry, which is kind of odd. Jim is given the job he ends up head of security in this nightclub that Bazza is co-running with a slightly mysterious business partner, a lady called Jo. Jim is almost immediately pulled into this kind of feud between the two co-owners, each kind of vying for Jimmy's loyalty. This culminates in yet another hospitalisation for Jimmy, someone who he identifies as Barry Grant runs him over. I think this happens after Jim gets into yet another feud. This time he feels he needs to take the law into his own hands over the Peter Harrison date rape case. Again, he's advised to just step back from it, but given his absence of self-control, can't really help himself. Anyway, I think Barry somehow comes out on top with this one, and Jimmy gets to retain his position within the club. However, this position brings him into contact with Brian the hairdresser. Now, the club, under Barry's direction, has taken to rave nights, and Brian seems particularly familiar with the territory of the little recreational powder pick-me-up that is popular on that scene. I mean, Jimmy, at this point, he seems like a rather unlikely candidate for any of this. He's already kind of pushed 40. That far in his life, he's an ale drinking man, and his addictive behaviour is limited to that, and a flutter down the bookies. However, he's kind of dared by I think it's Brian who kind of browbeats him into having a little curious sample of the wares that he's just confiscated. And this appears to work for Jim, and we talk about a slippery slope. This is interesting because you could argue that the series it takes the most extreme what if from somebody unexperienced in drugs taking a curious sample. They choose to pursue that story into the worst possible outcome, which of course not everyone who has a little inquisitive dabble goes that way. They choose to push that storyline with Jimmy way down into the sewer. Some people go that way. You don't have to walk far outside of here to encounter people that whose lives have took a dive with this stuff also. So just to say how much exaggerated that story is. Jim graduates from this to cocaine, which he becomes emotionally dependent upon fairly swiftly. He very unwisely allows himself to get talked into getting involved in an import deal that I think Brian is instrumental in setting up, which involves getting a large quantity into the country. Now Jimmy engages with this on the understanding that he's just going to receive this payoff for his efforts, but the reality is he ends up with this big envelope full of coke, which it then becomes his job to shift. And not being one for the don't get high on your own supply thing, that doesn't sink in with Jim. So this turns into a pretty fucking wild ride for him, which a crunch point of this is on the occasion, it might be Ron marrying Bev, I can't remember, but Jimmy finds himself very unwisely again at the wheel of a vehicle. He's already kind of under the influence, and he becomes momentarily distracted. I think he might be trying to stuff something else up his nose at a point at which a Rolls Royce is coming the other direction. Now this Jimmy inadvertently forces this one off the road, and of course this crashes, and it turns out it contains not only Frank Rogers, it's being driven by Frank Rogers, and it contains Ron and Dee Dee's youngest, little Tony. It's over for Frank, but Tony's kind of on life support in hospital. No witnesses are able to identify Jimmy's car, so for a while he kind of becomes the chief, he becomes the champion for fundraising for Tony, which of course puts him in the bosom of the Dixon family. He becomes, what an awkward position to get into. Tony expires on the life support machine, and Jim then finds himself in the position of having to be one of the pallbearers at the funeral. This proves too much for him. See, Jim, I think one of the reasons we like him is that he does still have a conscience. He's not the kind of cold monster who's okay with this and will just kind of go through this. It eats him up inside. It's the guilt of this, and this of course just digs him further and further into that world of drug use. So he breaks down at the funeral. He can't deal with it anymore, and confesses and this just blows the whole thing open, and colossal storyline explosion. Of course, Ron wants him in the seventh pit of hell, obviously, and Jim responds to his situation by just going on the mother of all benders, and the next step is once described to me as artificial comfort. Of course, his heroin, which Jim dives into with a vengeance. Now, there's a scene some days later where Jim turns up in the close. I'm not sure if it's where this cover picture's from, but he turns up on a bench in a park by the close, looking like absolute hell. And the one person to sort of take him in and wash him down and get a meal down him is, of all the people in the world, it's D.D. Dixon. Now, I think something Brookside was very good at was showing different perspectives, I suppose. It allowed a sympathetic perspective for a number of viewpoints, and Dee being, I suppose, after Sheila Grant, she was the second in this kind of almost a recurrent character trait, was the very staunchly Catholic matriarchal figure. I think Dee was kind of the second of those. And it's quite touching in a way that, though a lot of times those sort of characters, they can be seen as rather inflexible and a bit of a buzzkill in certain incidences, but Dee faith kind of allows her to show that kind of non-judgmental humanity to someone. Whatever Jimmy's done, he's in a terrible state within himself, and she can't turn that away. But this thing has got his claws into him. He's in it for the long haul at this point. Now, a little bit later on, I think he figures his life isn't worth living, and he might as well just dive into that bag as deeply as he can. It's the one thing that negates the feelings of worthlessness and guilt and all these things. And there's this point at which he's kind of unconscious in a crack house or in a shooting gallery. He comes to semi-consciousness to see the vengeful figure of Ron Dixon hovering over him with a bar. And Ron has clearly come for retribution, but I think when he sees the state Jimmy's in, I think he kind of realises that there's nothing he can do to Jimmy that is worse than what Jimmy is doing to himself at this stage. So it wasn't the first time this had been pulled in as a Brookside storyline, but it pursued it into the deep, dark, shadowy depths here. And this book, it doesn't take it to its conclusion. Jimmy he gets another spell in prison due to he's for the thing with the car, I think he actually gets away with. That's the thing, the justice system doesn't see fit to go after him for that. He just gets a rap on the knuckles for, I think it's for irresponsible driving or some shit, which considering he's wiped out, that's two of the... How many people live on the close? Jimmy has wiped out two members of the close. That's probably kind of 10% of the inhabitants or something in one go. But the law doesn't see fit to slap anything particular on him for that. However, his subsequent activities in going on the rob, and he proves very adept and very enthusiastic about that, going on the rob to fuel his habit, it lands Jimmy a spell eventually, in which, miraculously almost, he does succeed in cleaning up in jail. I think his cellmate in there is someone who's still an active user and is kind of getting smuggled in supplies, but Jimmy, once he's kind of sweated it out of his system, he somehow finds it in himself to kind of keep it at arm's length. However, it still represents a source of income to him, so we see him at the end of this book again. It's bookended by Jimmy stepping out of the prison gates, but this time he's resolved to treat it as a business kind of thing. So we're a long way from the redemption arc with Jimmy Corkhill at the time of this book's publication. A lot more goes on with the character in the years after that, and when you think back to Brookside, he's one of the first most prominent characters you think of. This book does, it handles, I suppose, the first part of his story. It does it it's very digestible. This writing is very easy to get through. And, like the previous one I covered of this, the Bing Diaries, it's a very easy, well, I wouldn't say an easy read, but it's easily readable, but, it tackles Jim with it. There's a certain amount of humour to the writing, and it avoids being too judgy with the character. And I don't know I'm not sure if they ever did a second part to this, possibly not. I know there's 2 editions of the Beth Jordache diaries, for instance, but we have a Jimmy Corkhill novel, which I didn't really realise until recently these things existed. So for a Brookie aficionado, this is quite a nice thing to have.